Somewhere right now, someone is turning their phone to silent, closing every group chat they've ever loved, and getting ready to disappear from every single person who has ever known them. Not because anything happened, not because of one big fight, but because the quiet feels easier than the alternative. Here's the part almost nobody expects going in. The version of loneliness that follows isn't gentle. Researchers who study social isolation have found that the brain treats sudden, total disconnection from other people as something closer to a physical injury than an emotional inconvenience. The same neural circuitry that lights up when your hand touches something hot lights up again when you cut yourself off from the people who used to know you best. The mind doesn't experience the silence you build as peace. For a while, it experiences it as a wound it can't explain. Welcome to Catastrophe Theory, where we figure out exactly how fast your life falls apart if you actually let the intrusive thoughts win. I'm CJ Theory, and today we're looking at what happens when you finally listen to the voice that's been telling you, quietly for weeks now, to just vanish. To mute the chats, let the calls ring out, stop replying to the people who love you, and disappear out of every relationship you've ever built, all at once on the same unremarkable afternoon. You are sitting on the edge of your bed at 11:47 at night, and for the first time in what feels like months, the silence in the room doesn't feel like something pressing down on you. It feels like something you finally chose. Your phone is face down on the comforter beside you, and you can feel it more than see it. The faint, occasional buzz against the fabric, someone's name lighting up a screen you're not going to turn over. Somewhere outside, a car passes with its windows down, a fragment of music trailing behind it and fading before you can place the song. The refrigerator hums in the kitchen down the hall, that low mechanical sound you only ever notice at night when everything else has gone quiet enough to let it in. You've been staring at the same 3 group chats for an hour. Not reading them exactly, watching them. Watching the little bubbles appear and disappear as someone types something, deletes it, types it again. Somebody asking if you're free this weekend. Somebody else sending a meme they clearly think you like, the kind of inside joke that used to make you laugh out loud in a room by yourself. You used to answer these within minutes. Tonight, you're looking at them the way you'd look at a stack of mail you already know is bad news. Not urgent exactly, but heavy in a way that makes picking it up feel like more effort than you have left in you. And somewhere in the last few weeks, a thought arrived that didn't feel dramatic at the time. It felt almost restful. What if you just stopped? Stopped replying, stopped explaining, stopped showing up in the version of your life these people think they still have access to. No confrontation, no dramatic goodbye text, no group announcement, just an absence. Let the messages pile up unread. Let the calls go to voicemail. Let the invitations arrive and quietly expire, the way plants die when nobody's paying attention to them anymore. Not from any single decisive act, just neglect accumulating one day at a time until the neglect becomes its own kind of decision. You tell yourself it's temporary. You tell yourself you just need space, and that the people who actually care about you will understand eventually once you're ready to explain, though some small, honest part of you already suspects you might never be ready, that the explaining might be the exact thing you're trying to avoid. You tell yourself this isn't really about any of them. It's about how tired you are of being reachable, how tired you are of performing a version of okay that stopped being true months ago, in every single conversation, to every single person, one exhausting exchange at a time. Your thumb finds the settings icon almost on its own. Do not disturb. Notifications off. And for one long, strange moment, watching the little switches flip from blue to gray, you feel something that catches you off guard. Not dread, not guilt, but relief. Real, physical relief, the kind that unclenches your shoulders before your brain has even caught up to what your hands just did. I want you to hold on to that feeling for a second, because it's going to matter later. That relief is real. It is not a trick your brain is playing on you, and it is not something to be ashamed of feeling. But I've spent a long time talking to people on the other side of that decision, people who went quiet on everyone they knew, sometimes for a few unbearable weeks, sometimes for the better part of a year, and every one of them describes that first night in almost the same language you're feeling right now: lighter. Finally, blessedly lighter. It's what happens after that first night that almost nobody warns you about, and it's what happens to the people left holding a silence they never agreed to, that almost nobody talks honestly about at all. This isn't a video about whether you were justified in needing space. Sometimes you absolutely are. Burnout is real, certain relationships genuinely are more draining than sustaining, and there is nothing shameful about needing to protect your own capacity before you have any left to give anyone else. This is a video about what actually happens, biologically, socially, and psychologically, in the space between the night you decide to disappear and the day, if it ever comes, that you try to come back. Because the going quiet is almost never the hard part. The hard part starts afterwards in a silence that keeps accruing interest, whether you're paying attention to it or not. So let's take this apart carefully, the way it actually unfolds, instead of the way it feels like it's going to unfold on the night you turn the notifications off. Here's where it starts, and it starts somewhere you wouldn't expect. Not in your heart, and not really even in your head, but in a part of your nervous system that evolved for an entirely different kind of danger. For most of human history, being cut off from your group wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. A human being alone on the savannah without the protection of a tribe was a human being who didn't survive long enough to pass anything on. So evolution did something clever and, in the modern world, more than a little inconvenient. It wired social pain and physical pain into overlapping circuitry in the brain. Researchers studying this have found that the same region that lights up when your body registers an injury, the anterior cingulate cortex, if you want the technical name for it, also lights up when you experience social rejection or isolation. Your brain, in a very real, measurable sense, does not fully distinguish between being cut off from your tribe and being physically wounded. It treats both as the same category of emergency. Which means the plan you made at 11:47 at night wasn't just a social decision. It was, neurologically speaking, closer to volunteering for an injury. And your nervous system, true to its ancient design, is going to respond to that injury exactly the way it responds to any other one. With an initial numbing, followed days or weeks later by an ache that gets harder and harder to ignore. That initial numbing is the part you already felt. It's real, and there's a reason it happens. Cutting off contact with people who've been asking things of you, however lovingly, however reasonably, removes a category of demand your nervous system has been quietly straining against for a long time. Fewer messages means fewer decisions. Fewer decisions means less of that low, constant hum of obligation that builds up in a person who's been running on empty. For a few days, sometimes longer, the silence genuinely does feel like rest, because in a narrow, immediate sense, it is rest. This is where a lot of people mistake the beginning of the story for the whole story and log the relief as proof they made the right call, without ever finding out what the next chapter looks like. But somewhere around the second or third week, and this timeline moves differently for everyone, so don't treat it as a countdown clock, something starts to shift underneath the relief. This is where I want to bring in a concept that shaped decades of research on loneliness, developed largely through the work of the social neuroscientist John Cacioppo, who spent much of his career studying what chronic isolation actually does to a human body. Cacioppo described loneliness not as a mood, but as a biological alarm state, something closer to hunger or thirst than to sadness. Hunger exists to tell you that you need food before your body runs out of energy to function. Loneliness, in this framework, exists to tell you that you need connection before your capacity to function socially starts to erode. It is not a character flaw showing up. It is a smoke detector doing exactly the job it was built to do. Here's the uncomfortable part. Like most alarm systems, it doesn't turn off just because you'd rather not hear it. Cacioppo's research found that sustained loneliness produces measurable changes throughout the body. Elevated cortisol, a stress hormone that at chronically high levels wears down nearly every system it touches. Disrupted sleep architecture, even in people who are technically sleeping the same number of hours. And a subtle but persistent shift in immune function, as though the body starts bracing for a threat that never quite arrives, because the threat it's bracing for is the absence of a tribe, and there's no antibody for that. None of this happens on the first night. Almost all of it happens in the silence that follows, in the weeks nobody's watching closely enough to notice the toll being taken. And this is where the story takes its first real turn, the one almost nobody sees coming when they're the one initiating the silence. Because the isolation you engineered doesn't just sit there accumulating cost in the background, it starts to change the way you think about the very people you cut off, and not in the direction you'd expect. There's a psychological phenomenon sometimes described as motivated reasoning, and it does something particularly cruel in exactly this situation. The longer you go without responding to someone, the more your brain needs a story that makes the not responding feel justified, because holding "I'm hurting someone who cares about me for no clear reason" for weeks at a time is almost unbearable. So the brain does what brains do under that kind of pressure. It starts quietly editing the story. That friend who texted 3 times checking in stops registering as someone worried about you and starts registering almost imperceptibly as someone being a little much. The one who finally stopped reaching out after the 4th unanswered message stops registering as someone who respected your space and starts registering as proof that they never really cared that much to begin with. None of this is a conscious lie you're telling yourself. It's your own mind trying to make the math add up, trying to convert guilt into justification, because justification is so much easier to carry around for months at a time than guilt is. This is usually where the second wave of the story begins, the part where the silence stops being a decision you're actively making and starts being a wall you no longer know how to get around, even on the days you want to. Because here's the thing about avoidance that almost every field of psychology studying anxiety and behavior has documented in one form or another. Avoidance works, in the short term, disturbingly well. Every time you don't open that group chat, the small spike of dread you feel about opening it drops immediately. Your nervous system logs that outcome as a success. Avoided the thing, felt better right away. Do that again next time. This is, mechanically, the exact same reinforcement loop that keeps a phobia alive. Someone afraid of dogs who crosses the street to avoid one feels immediate relief, and that relief teaches the nervous system that crossing the street was the correct move, which makes the next dog feel a little more frightening, not less. Every day you don't reply to the people you used to talk to constantly, the returning gets a little harder, not because more time has passed, but because your own brain has just logged one more piece of evidence that avoiding was the right call. Which raises the question almost nobody asks themselves on that first quiet night, when the relief still feels clean and uncomplicated. If avoiding keeps feeling like relief, what exactly is supposed to interrupt that loop before it becomes the only way you know how to relate to people at all? Let's sit with that question for a moment, because the answer is stranger and a little more hopeful than it first appears. But to get there, we need to talk honestly about what's actually happening on the other end of the silence, to the people you've gone quiet on, because their experience of this story is as very real as yours, and it's the part almost nobody bothers to walk through. There's a term researchers who study loss use for a particular kind of grief: ambiguous loss. It was originally used to describe situations where someone is physically absent but psychologically present, a missing person, a parent with advanced dementia who's still in the room but no longer fully there. It applies with uncomfortable precision to what happens to a person on the receiving end of a sudden, unexplained disappearance. Their friend hasn't died. There was no funeral, no closure, no explanation, nothing to grieve in the normal, socially sanctioned way. There's just a person who used to exist vividly in their life and now exists as an open question with no answer attached. Did I do something? Are they okay? Should I be worried? Should I be angry about someone who might just be struggling? Ambiguous loss is, according to the researchers who've studied it most closely, uniquely difficult to process precisely because it never resolves into anything clean enough to move past. You can't grieve what you're not sure has actually ended. Which means the silence you built to protect your own capacity to cope is, on the other end of the line, generating its own quiet compounding cost, not because you intended harm, almost never because you intended harm, but because disappearance doesn't distribute pain evenly. It just relocates it from a version you can control in your own head on your own timeline to a version someone else now has to carry with absolutely no information and no say in the matter at all. I don't say any of this to make you feel worse than you might already feel hearing it. I say it because understanding both sides of this equation is the only way the next part of this video is actually useful to you, rather than just one more source of guilt to avoid thinking about, which, as we've already covered, your brain is disturbingly good at avoiding. So let's clear up some of the beliefs that tend to grow quietly and convincingly in exactly this kind of silence, because a few of them are dangerous enough to keep good, caring people trapped in a pattern that's actively working against the peace they're chasing. The first myth goes something like this. Cutting people off is basically the same as healthy boundary setting, and if boundary setting with one difficult person is good for you, then cutting off everyone must be even better for you. The reality is considerably more complicated than that. Boundary setting, in the way therapists actually describe it, is selective and communicated. It involves identifying a specific relationship or specific behavior that's causing you harm and finding some way, however imperfect, to signal that a change is needed. Sudden global withdrawal from every relationship you have is a fundamentally different action, and researchers who study depression and burnout have long noted that widespread social withdrawal, pulling away from everyone at once rather than renegotiating specific relationships, is one of the more common and more overlooked features of both conditions. That doesn't mean everyone who goes quiet on their whole social circle is depressed. It means the two patterns can look identical from the outside, and sometimes from the inside too, which is exactly why this particular myth is so easy to believe and so worth questioning honestly, rather than assuming it's automatically self-care simply because it feels protective in the moment. The second myth is the one that does the most quiet damage, and it sounds like this. If they were really my friends, they'll understand, and honestly, they probably won't even notice I'm gone. We've already walked through why the first half of that sentence tends to be true in a much more painful way than people expect. The friends who actually cared are usually the ones who understand least, precisely because they cared enough to be confused and hurt by an absence with no explanation attached to it. And the second half of the sentence, the idea that people barely notice, runs directly against what the research on ambiguous loss tells us about how deeply an unexplained disappearance actually registers with the person left behind. It is almost never a quiet non-event on their end. It is more often a low, persistent question that follows them around for weeks, sometimes years, with no resolution in sight. The third myth is one of the most seductive because it sounds like patience rather than avoidance. Once I feel better, reconnecting will be just as easy as it used to be, so there's no real cost to waiting as long as I need to. But we've already covered the mechanics of why this usually isn't true. Avoidance doesn't sit still while you wait for the right moment. It compounds. Every week that passes adds another layer of explanation you feel you now owe people, another reason the return feels bigger and more fraught than the original silence ever did, another log entry in your nervous system's running tally that not reaching out is the safer option. The version of you who feels ready to reconnect after 6 months of total silence is not dealing with the same task as the version of you who might have reached back out after 2 weeks. The task gets heavier the longer it's deferred, almost without exception, no matter how much lighter the silence itself continues to feel in the meantime. The fourth myth is the trickiest one to untangle because it's wrapped around a truth that genuinely matters. This is just introversion or self-care or an appropriate response to how depleted I've been, not a symptom of anything worth paying closer attention to. And sometimes that's exactly what it is. Needing significantly less social contact than you used to for a defined period while you recover from something genuinely exhausting is a completely legitimate and often healthy adjustment. But sudden, total withdrawal from every relationship at once, not just fewer plans, but radio silence, not just needing quiet, but needing to be unreachable, is also one of the patterns clinicians are trained to ask about when they're screening for depression, burnout, or an anxiety disorder that's gotten large enough to swallow a person's whole social world. I'm not a therapist, and I'm not diagnosing you, and I genuinely don't know which version of this you're living through right now, but I'd rather ask you the honest question directly than let a comforting label like self-care quietly stand for an answer you haven't actually looked at yet. Does the silence feel like rest, or does it feel like hiding? Those two things can look remarkably alike from the inside, at least at first, and only one of them tends to still feel like rest a month later. So if you're somewhere in the middle of this right now, already quiet on people you used to talk to every day, or standing at the edge of that decision the way the version of you at 11:47 at night was standing at the edge of it, here's what I actually want you to do, not what I wish you'd already done. 1. Before you go dark on everyone, separate the specific relationships that are genuinely costing you something from the general exhaustion that's making all of them feel heavy at once. Almost every person I've talked to who went quiet on their whole social circle later realized that only a handful of those relationships were actually the problem, the demanding ones, the one-sided ones, the ones that never gave back what they asked for. The rest simply got swept up in a blanket withdrawal that was really only meant for 1 or 2 people, and untangling that afterwards is a great deal harder than sorting it out before you disappear. 2. If you genuinely need space, consider giving that space an edge instead of leaving it open-ended. An open-ended silence is the version that tends to spiral because there's no natural moment that signals it's time to come back, and the longer it stretches, the more the avoidance loop reinforces itself. A silence with a rough shape to it, even something as loose as "I need a few weeks," gives your nervous system a landing point to aim for instead of an indefinite drop. 3. Keep one lifeline open, even if it's small. Not everyone, not a group chat. One person you trust enough to say something as simple as, "I need to go quiet for a while. I'm not upset with you, I just need space and I'll be back." That single message does 2 things at once. It interrupts the myth that nobody will notice or wonder, and it gives you a single thread you haven't fully cut, which makes the eventual return infinitely less daunting than trying to re-enter every relationship at once from a standing start of total silence. 4. Watch for the difference between rest and avoidance as the days pass, honestly and without judgment. Rest tends to replenish something. You notice small flickers of wanting to reach out again, even if you're not acting on them yet. Avoidance tends to deepen instead, the thought of reconnecting growing more overwhelming rather than less, the specific relationships blurring into one undifferentiated wall of obligation you can't imagine facing. If you notice the second pattern settling in rather than the first, that's useful information, not a failure. It's simply a sign that this has quietly become a pattern that a support system, and not just time alone, might genuinely help with. 5. If it's been weeks and the idea of reconnecting has started to feel not just difficult but impossible, if the thought of typing a single message brings on real physical dread, that's worth naming out loud to someone qualified to help you make sense of it. A therapist, a doctor, a counselor, someone whose entire job is separating an understandable need for rest from a mood or anxiety pattern that's begun running the show. There is nothing weak about asking for that kind of outside perspective. If anything, it tends to be the single fastest way out of a loop that avoidance, left to its own devices, is not designed to interrupt on its own. 6. When you do decide to reach back out, resist the urge to write the perfect, fully explained apology before you'll allow yourself to send anything at all. That instinct to over-explain, to account for every week of silence in painstaking detail, is often just avoidance wearing a more productive-looking disguise, one more reason to keep delaying the actual message a little longer. A short, honest reconnection almost always lands better than a long, guilt-soaked essay. I've been in a rough stretch and went quiet on almost everyone. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I've been thinking about you. That's a complete sentence. It doesn't need 6 paragraphs of justification attached to it to do its job. 7. Expect the reconnection to feel awkward, and let it be awkward without treating the awkwardness as proof that you've ruined something beyond repair. Most relationships, it turns out, are considerably more durable than the anxious mind gives them credit for in the moment. A stretch of silence, even an unexplained one, is rarely the unforgivable event it feels like from inside the isolation. It's simply a gap that needs one honest conversation to start closing, not a verdict on whether the relationship was ever real to begin with. And if, once you've had some real space and some real reflection, you realize a particular relationship genuinely wasn't serving you, that's allowed to be the outcome too. Not every relationship that gets caught in a period of withdrawal needs to be fully restored to survive the process. The goal was never to force every single connection back to exactly where it was. The goal is simply to make sure the withdrawal was actually a choice you made with clear eyes, rather than a wall your own nervous system built for you while you weren't looking closely enough to notice it happening. Here's what I actually think, underneath all the biology and the behavioral research we've just walked through together. The urge to disappear on everyone you know was never really about any single person in your life, and it was never really a character flaw showing up out of nowhere either. Somewhere in the exhaustion that led you to that 11:47 at night moment, disappearing felt like the only form of control still available to you. The one lever left to pull when everything else about your life felt like it was asking more of you than you had left to give. For a little while, going quiet feels like the only kind of rest that doesn't require anyone's permission. I understand that impulse completely, because it's a deeply, almost universally human one. Every person who has ever felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of being known by other people has felt some version of the pull towards silence, towards simply not existing in anyone's field of view for a while. That instinct isn't broken. It's actually one of the oldest, most protective instincts a person has, the same one that tells an exhausted animal to retreat to somewhere quiet and heal before rejoining the group. The mistake isn't feeling the pull. The mistake is letting an instinct built for temporary retreat quietly reshape itself, week after silent week, until the very thing that was supposed to protect you starts costing you the exact connection you were trying to protect your capacity for in the first place. Loneliness, in the end, isn't a design flaw in the human nervous system. It's a remarkably sophisticated one, an alarm calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years to make absolutely sure a creature that depends on other creatures to survive never drifts too far from the group without noticing. The ache you'll likely feel a few weeks into any real silence isn't your body malfunctioning. It's your body doing exactly the job it was built to do, sounding an alarm you weren't necessarily ready to hear, at a moment when you needed rest more than you needed a reminder. Both things can be true at once. You can need the quiet and still need to make sure the quiet doesn't quietly become the only way you know how to exist around other people. So if that pull toward disappearing is somewhere in your life right now, not hypothetically, but actually, tonight, phone face down on the bed beside you, I'd ask you to take the rest you need without mistaking it for a decision to leave for good. Give it an edge. Keep one thread open. Watch the difference between the version of quiet that's slowly refilling you and the version of quiet that's just spiraling. And when you're ready, not perfectly ready, not fully explained yourself ready, just ready enough to type one honest sentence, let the ordinary, unremarkable version of your life come back to you, still known, still reachable, still in all the boringly wonderful ways that actually matter, connected. But that's just a theory, a catastrophe theory. Thanks for not ruining your life.